I'm Mark Golub, and in the news, Hamas at war with Israel. There's really nothing new in the story. If you're anyone who's been following events in the Palestinian world and in Israel, you know all too well that Israel is under constant assault by Hamas in Gaza, and that in reality Israel has not known a single day of true peace in its 71 years of existence. There have been a series of ceasefires, as has again been implemented in this round of Hamas attacks, but no peace, ever. Hamas represents those in the leadership of the Palestinian world who want nothing less than an end to the Jewish state of Israel. Hamas and those who support Hamas, and many argue it's true for Fatah as well. Their real goal is to fulfill the chant you now hear from SJP on college and university campuses throughout America, throughout the Western nations. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Hamas has no interest in a two-state solution. Hamas wants all of pre-war Palestine. And they have no compunction or shame in firing hundreds and hundreds of rockets into Israel, into Israeli towns and villages and cities, sending petrified children running to bomb shelters with only seconds to reach safety. And in this latest attack on Israel, and this is the way the mainstream media should be characterizing Hamas's grotesque bombardment of Israel as an attack, this latest attack on Israel by Hamas has taken Israeli lives. This past weekend, Hamas fired nearly 700 rockets from Gaza into Israel. Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system reportedly intercepted about 150 of those rockets, and that means some 450 rockets got through Israel's defense forces. On the screen right now, let's put it back one more second. On the screen right now, you see a home that was bombarded by Hamas rocket fire. Incidentally, I wanted to stay up one more moment, and our guest is on the phone listening to my open, so we're going to talk to him about it in a moment. We tried to find on Google photographs of Israeli homes and the damage done by Hamas rockets in Israel. And you can Google, and you can do a Google search on Google and look for photographs. And we put in Israeli Hamas rocket fire into Israel. Virtually every single picture that came up on Google was a picture of a Palestinian home or apartment that was hit by Israeli rocket fire in reprisals for the Hamas attacks. We had to search for one photograph of an Israeli home that was victimized by Hamas rocket fire. 4 Israelis were killed by Hamas rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. On Sunday morning, a 58-year-old father of 4 was hit with shrapnel to his chest and stomach in the yard of his home in Ashkelon after a Hamas rocket slammed into his apartment building. On Sunday afternoon, 2 Israelis were killed in a strike on Ashkelon when a rocket slammed into a factory, and when a Hamas rocket also hit a car driving in southern Israel. And a 21-year-old man became the 4th civilian killed after a rocket struck an apartment building in the southern coastal city of Ashdod. It also turns out that Hamas has been using cyber attacks against Israel, prompting the IDF to take action to stop Hamas's efforts. And the IDF has also taken out a tunnel Hamas dug to send murderers from Gaza into Israel. The IDF also responded Sunday with attacks on some 280 Hamas and Islamic Jihad military targets, including a strike on a building in a residential neighborhood in Gaza that Hamas was using for operational purposes, protecting and hiding terrorist infrastructures. And now, some 700 rockets later, Hamas leaders have said they don't want war with Israel. Well, it's one thing for us to read about this in America, but how do Israelis feel about events of this past weekend and about Hamas and Gaza in general? For some insight, we're joined now by the wonderful military correspondent of the Times of Israel, Judah Ari Gross. Judah, thank you so much for making time with us and joining us again on JBS.
Absolutely.
Judah, bring us up to date. Where do things stand right now? And again, Israel, it's nighttime in Israel now, but here on Monday night, where do things stand for the state of Israel?
So things, as you said, nearly 700 rockets and mortar shells were fired into Israel over the course of about 2 days, a little less than 48 hours, starting Saturday morning, ending Sunday night. Things technically continued into Monday morning until about 2:30 a.m. A ceasefire, sort of an unofficial ceasefire, was declared starting about 4:30 a.m. And that's sort of where things stand in terms of the fighting, that it's basically stopped as of this morning. The IDF removed all security, safety instructions that were in place for southern Israel. Schools were reopened, though a few towns and communities decided to keep their schools closed as a precautionary measure, even though they were allowed to open them. And now everyone in Israel is sort of looking around and trying to figure out what just happened over the past 2 days.
Yes.
And the general consensus is not obviously a huge amount of devastation. The loss of 4 Israeli civilians, as well as, Palestinians killed. About half of them have already been identified as member of terrorist groups. The other half have not been identified as such. But sort of in terms of advancing any specific causes, Israel is very much back to where it was before this happened. And considering, depending on how you count, this is the 8th time that Israel and terror groups in the Strip have gone, into this type of escalation of violence and exchange of fire, people are more and more starting to wonder what's all this about? Is it working towards anything on either side?
Mm-hmm. In a moment, you'll explain to me what you mean on either side, but there have been some who have suggested Hamas was motivated to do this because of the upcoming Eurovision Song Festival in Israel. Many people from outside of Israel are now heading towards Israel and will be attending the Eurovision contest in Tel Aviv, and that what Hamas was trying to do is provoke Israel into doing something that would make Israel look bad. In Israel, is that a theory or not?
So just to clarify, in all of this, in terms of these ongoing negotiations or indirect negotiations between Israel and Hamas, Israel has something it wants to get out of this. Israel wants quiet, and end to rocket fire, and end to the violent riots along the border, the incendiary balloons, the explosives, etc. And the Palestinians want something too. They want the blockade, the naval blockade around the Gaza Strip to be lightened, if not removed entirely. Both sides have things that they are hoping to get out of these ongoing negotiations. Is what I meant. Regarding the Eurovision, while in the United States it's not that big of a deal, in most of the rest of the world, especially in Europe and parts of the Middle East, it's a very big deal. With lots of interest, millions of viewers around the world. And so for it to be held in Israel is a very big deal.
It's
here.
A big deal. Yeah.
It means a lot of tourists coming in. It means a lot of publicity and famous people talking about Israel.
Yes.
It's a nice thing.
Yes.
And so because it's this big, showy, flashy cultural event, obviously it's also a potential target for, terrorism, for attacks for things to happen not necessarily in Tel Aviv, but just at the same time in order to, cast a pall over the events, much in the same way that it happened last year with the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem, having a large-scale protest in which lots of people were killed the same day. You have the split-screen phenomenon in which on one side you have festivities, on the other side you have fires and bloodshed. It doesn't really look good for anyone. Mm-hmm. And this was a concern that the Israeli military had before this fighting began. From the latest information that I have from the IDF, they don't believe that that's currently in the cards. That the groups in the Strip are somewhat deterred from this last bout, in which the IDF hit hundreds of targets and killed a number of their members. That they wouldn't be inclined to conduct such an attack, knowing that another round like this would be even would potentially be even harder. And so where it stands now is that was a concern in the lead up. And now, while the IDF is still on high alert in the coming weeks, it doesn't seem to be where things are going now.
Okay. By the way, Judah, I should just give you one moment. Explain to our audience why this year's Eurovision Song Festival will be in Tel Aviv.
Oh, so the way the Eurovision Song Contest works is the winner of the previous year. Every country sends a representative, an act, to go and perform a song. It's not really my preferred genre of music, but to each their own. So a winner is chosen each year by vote, and the winner, their country, hosts it the next year. So last year the winner was a woman named Netta Barzilai with a song called Toy. So this year Israel hosted. It's the first time in 20 years since the Eurovision has been hosted in Israel. So it's a pretty big deal.
Yes, it is.
For the country here. Everyone's pretty excited about it.
Yes, and it was nice for an Israeli to win. When you described the sort of how both sides have an interest, are you suggesting to our audience that in some way you feel that Hamas is justified in sending rockets into Israel in order to, for example, get Israel to lift a naval blockade?
Oh, in no way, shape, or form. I mean, this is, a completely indiscriminate attack on civilians is 100% beyond the pale, unconscionable and unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And while Hamas seems to think, I'm not judging not in an attempt to judge the legitimacy of it, but in terms of its ability to achieve results, this tactic has been relatively effective for Hamas, and there's no reason for it to continue doing so now. It's horrible, yes, but it's also relatively effective. Especially when you look how Israel, in terms of getting concessions from Israel, it has been relatively effective.
It has been.
Israel did expand after a number of bouts between Israel and Hamas. Israel decided to expand the permitted fishing zone. Yes. Around the Gaza Strip, letting Gaza fishermen go to areas that they haven't been able to reach since 2006. It's a pretty significant. While we might not think of fishing as such a big deal in Gaza, where the economy is absolutely horrible, that brings in additional money and is a real sign to the people of Gaza. Hey, Hamas, we made this happen for you, and gives them a sense of legitimacy. Mm-hmm. So we read criticism of Israel all the time in terms of the way Israel has implemented a blockade of all kinds of goods and services, including medical supplies. There's this criticism that Israel has basically created an outdoor prison, keeping Gazans in Gaza as a poor, wretched community inside a very small portion of territory, and that in essence, it is Israel that needs to be
that needs to ease the restrictions, to ease the blockade. When you talk about the amount of ocean that Gazans are now going to be permitted to fish in, one could ask, Judah, what was the big deal? Why did Israel ever make an issue over how much ocean Gazans could fish in? And it seems to validate the criticisms of those who stand over against Israel and say the real bad guy in this story is the state of Israel for what it's doing to the Gazan people. What's your response?
The state of Israel has legitimate concerns that lead to this blockade, which the United Nations has said is a legal blockade for whatever that's worth. I don't put much faith into the UN to make decisions. But in terms of this blockade, the concerns that Israel have is real, that Hamas, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other terror groups out the Strip would use everything at their disposal to import huge amounts of advanced weaponry into the Gaza Strip that would make the lives of Israelis far, far, far more miserable than they already are with the meager amount of raw materials that Hamas has at its disposal today. That's a perfectly legitimate concern that Israel has. You can get into some specific arguments about basically Israel keeps a list of permitted items into the Gaza Strip and regulated ones and forbidden ones. You can argue about how every single thing goes onto that list. Should it be regulated? Should it be banned? But overall, it's a perfectly legitimate concern, one that bears out in the number of times that Israel has found Hamas and other terror groups attempting to smuggle contraband that are clearly for military purposes. Mm-hmm. So with that regard, it's not you can argue about some very specific finer points of it, but the overall concerns leading to the blockade are legitimate. Mm-hmm. At the same time, does that negatively impact civilians in the Gaza Strip? Yes, it does. I mean, it's incontrovertibly. It makes their lives more difficult, both in terms of bringing in materials and also in terms of exporting them out. It's a problem. It makes things more difficult for them.
So,
but there's no one thing that would change the dynamic entirely and make things easier.
And that would be?
No, there is no one thing that.
There is no one.
Okay, we just do this, and now now we can do importing, exporting more easily from Gaza. Uh-huh. It's an unfortunate situation, undoubtedly, but Israel's concerns are legitimate, as are Egypt's, which also imposes a blockade on the Gaza Strip.
You know, there are people who say Israel is doing all this because it is heartless and simply wants to be mean and to brutalize and to humiliate the Palestinians living in Gaza. Is there any of that? If we were to canvass the Israeli people, is there any main thinking that is critical of Israel as if it is malevolent in its blockade of Gaza?
I'm sorry. What's the question? Sorry.
Are there Israelis who feel? Is there any major thought that the claim that Israel is malevolent, that Israel is doing this not for defensive purposes, but is doing it just because it wants to humiliate and hurt Gazans because it doesn't like Palestinians? Is there any truth to that?
Are there individuals who think that way? Sure, there's horrible individuals in any society. But in terms of serious trends within Israeli society, I don't think you're going to find that except around the fringes of the fringes.
Okay. So, Judah, what do you think Israelis want Israel to do now? And, when you described what was happening, and I know you don't mean it to sound this way, but I want you to know it does. It sounds as if Israelis have become accustomed to this, and their attitude is, okay, so it'll happen for a day or two or three, and then it will stop and life will continue. And so it's almost ho-hum. I'm assuming that when I read about terrorized children, and when I read about civilians, even if it's only 4 actually being killed by Hamas attacks, this is very upsetting to Israelis. So I want to know from you, am I right that Israelis are upset by this? And what do you think Israelis want the Israeli government to do in response to this repeated, over and over, attacks with rockets by Hamas?
I think frankly, for some Israelis, it's a thing that happens. It's ho-hum, it's annoying, but it doesn't directly affect them personally. And so it does take on a certain, oh, this again. Obviously, that's not true for the people who live in the 20 miles or so from the Gaza Strip, who are really the ones that are in the line of fire, who have to spend nights in bomb shelters, whose children do suffer from, you can't even call it post-traumatic stress disorder because it's ongoing trauma, who have dogs that they have to give, anxiety medication to because they can't stand the sounds of bombs either. Obviously, for them, this is not something that's sort of ho-hum and, oh, this again. It's a visceral and horrible thing that they deal with on a regular basis. But for Israelis who live in Haifa, where it doesn't really affect them so much, no, they probably aren't. They're probably more concerned about other issues. Mm-hmm. For better or worse, people are allowed to live their lives without always thinking about their neighbors, across the country.
Yes.
In terms of what Israelis want the government to do, I don't think you're going to find any consensus on the issue other than something. People want the government to do something. If that means agreeing to certain concessions to Gaza in order to help the civilian population there and avoid war, some people will say, sure, we should do that. In terms of a large-scale military operation to retake over the Gaza Strip and bring back Israeli settlements that were evicted from there in 2005 in the disengagement, you're going to find Israelis that say we should do that as well. But I don't think there's any Israelis that say that the status quo is good or acceptable. Mm-hmm. People might have differences of opinion about what exactly the government should do, but they all know that it has to do something about this situation because beyond being terrible in terms of human life and damage to buildings and the effect that it's having throughout the country, it's just become bordering on becoming a farce at this point, where there's literally a script. You know how the day is going to go out, and it just plays along those lines. There's fighting, and then there's maybe a ceasefire, and then Israel says, oh, there is no ceasefire, but there's a ceasefire because the fire is stopped. Yes. And so everyone knows that something's got. But even you're not hearing a lot of really creative thinking about what that could be, including from politicians and the people in position to make these things happen.
Sitting in America, watching this happen to the Israeli people, American Jews who care about Israel feel this is outrageous. It's outrageous that the world community permits Hamas, just watches Hamas do this, when most of us believe if this were done by any other country to another country, the world outrage would be universal. And so there's a certain sense within the Jewish world of, this is infuriating, it's a form of anti-Semitism, and that in general, the United States of America, the United Nations, nations of goodwill, should be saying to Hamas, we support Israel in this. This is totally unacceptable, and it has to stop, or else we as a world community are going to take some kind of action against Hamas. That's how it appears to us, Judah, here in America. It doesn't sound to me like that's how Israelis universally feel about it, and that in some way it makes it even more of a tragic human situation, not simply for the Palestinians. And you have to feel bad for Palestinians who are basically held hostage by very corrupt leaderships. But it also is a tragic situation for Israelis. And I just love any comment you have on that?
I think in general, for most Israelis, the view of what the world thinks is not necessarily a primary concern. At this point in time, I think a lot of Israelis sort of think that world opinion is not and will not be with them. So let's not really pay it any mind. I will say that in this latest round of fighting, there were sort of widespread condemnations of the Hamas and Islamic Jihad rocket fire. Of course, you can always say more. They should, he should, but the condemnations came from around the world, including from countries that are no strangers to criticizing Israel, to put it lightly. So, I mean, that, I guess, at least in some cases, that criticism does come. In other cases, people tend to err on the side of caution, thinking that this is a more complicated situation, and so it's better to not get involved.
Judah, do you believe if Israel made concessions, all the rocket fire would stop?
So there's a number of reports that are sort of coming out now. Exactly what are the terms of this ceasefire? But from the general information that's coming out, it's going back to a lot of the agreements from the last ceasefire, which again raises the question of if Israel and Hamas were just going to go back to the same ceasefire from last time, why did they fight a 2-day battle and have people die on both sides? What was the point of it all if you're just going to go back to exactly where things were before? But what that means is allowing Qatar to bring some money into the Gaza Strip to pay for a number of different projects, not just to give the money over to Hamas, though if Hamas is the government, sort of all the money coming into the Gaza Strip is basically going to Hamas in one way or another. It also means Israel is going to expand the fishing zone again and potentially make some other easing certain things on the blockade in terms of what comes in and out. And in exchange, Israel would get an end to rocket fire, an end to the violent riots along the border, an end to the sort of fire balloons or incendiary devices that are sent over the border that have set fire to huge swaths of agricultural fields and grasslands in southern Israel. So that's sort of how things are looking like they're going to be in the coming days. But again, this is all sort of based off of reports, most of it from the Gaza Strip, not from the Israeli government, which doesn't want to publicly acknowledge conducting negotiations with a terrorist group, so it decides to just not acknowledge that these things are happening, even though they're clearly happening.
I understand.
So.
Look, I could talk to you all day. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I hope you'll let me call you in the near future and continue the discussion. I love hearing your insights, Judah, and I thank you always for making time for me on JBS. Kol tuv v'hatzlacha, you be well, and I hope, as you say, whatever rocket fire was there this past weekend, it is now over, and you and your families and all the people of Israel will live in some degree of safety in the coming days. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Be well. Judah Ari Gross, military correspondent for the Times of Israel. He has an interesting perspective. It's hard for me to believe that any concession Israel could make would change Hamas's overall attitude and overall strategy. My thanks as always to our director, Dara Golub, together with Michael Paley and John McDevitt. Thanks also to our producer for this edition of In the News, Carol Lilienthal. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.